The following content may contain visuals that are disturbing, graphic, or sensitive in nature. Viewer discretion is advised. This material is intended for mature audiences and may not be suitable for all viewers. Please exercise caution while watching, and if you find such content distressing, we recommend discontinuing viewing. This disclaimer is provided to ensure awareness and to prioritize viewer well-being.
Hello and welcome. You're watching Global Lens on News9 Live with me, Neha Khanna. As always, we have a packed show for you with all the top news stories from around the globe. Let's get started with our big focus. Israel's National Security Minister and controversial far-right leader Itamar Ben-Gvir has threatened to bring down the Netanyahu government if it reaches what he calls a reckless hostage deal with Hamas. Ben-Gvir heads the right-wing Otzma Yehudit party, whose support was lent to Netanyahu's Likud party when they came to power after the last election. Ben-Gvir's threat came amid apparent progress on a proposed agreement to free the 136 hostages remaining in Gaza who were kidnapped by Hamas during its 7th October attack in southern Israel. In an apparent response to Ben-Gvir's tweet, opposition leader Yair Lapid wrote on X that his Yesh Atid party and its 24 Knesset members would give the government full backing for a deal to free the hostages. Lapid wrote, "In the last 116 days, I have met with dozens of families of abductees. I promised them, and I repeat my promise, we will give the government a safety net for any deal that will return the abductees to their homes and families. This is our commitment to the abductees and their families." Qatar-based Hamas political bureau chief Ismail Haniyeh has said that his group would study the proposal received from negotiations between the interested parties in Paris last Sunday, adding that he would soon visit Cairo for talks on the initiative. Haniyeh said the priority for Hamas is an end to Israel's military offensive in Gaza and a withdrawal of all troops from the coastal enclave. The demand to end the war runs counter to Israel's stated goal of destroying Hamas. Now, according to the Israeli Prime Minister's office, the Paris meeting was defined as constructive. However, there are still significant gaps which the sides will continue to discuss at additional mutual meetings to be held this week. Mossad chief David Barnea, Israel Security Agency or Shin Bet director Ronen Bar and Major General Nitzan Alon, the Israel Defense Forces pointsman for hostage negotiations, met with Qatari and Egyptian mediators at the Paris talks. The Qatari Prime Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdul Rahman Al Thani, Abbas Kamel, the head of the Egyptian General Intelligence Directorate, and CIA Director William Burns also participated in the crucial meeting. Unconfirmed reports described the emerging agreement as a 2-month ceasefire with the release of more than 100 hostages in Israel, and this would be done in a staged manner. Israel would also increase the amount of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip and commute the prison sentences of an unspecified number of Palestinian terrorists if the deal goes through. Meanwhile, Israeli aircraft and artillery have again intensified attacks on Khan Yunis in southern Gaza, with helicopters and drones circling several locations. The Israeli police announced the death of an officer killed during the 7th October Hamas attack before his body was taken to Gaza, bringing the number of hostages thought to be dead to 29. Britain's Foreign Secretary has said the United Kingdom will consider recognizing a Palestinian state, contrary to what Netanyahu has been saying.
Part of correcting the mistake, of the recognition of the mistaken conception that brought upon us the 7th of October and brought upon us the deportation, is to return back home to Gush Katif and North Samaria. Today, everyone already understands that fleeing brings war, and that if you do not want another 7th of October, you have to return home to control the territory. We are settling our land from width to length, controlling it and fighting terror always, and bringing with God's help security to all of Israel. You know what the answer is. Without settlement, there is no security.
Some of this rhetoric and the language that was attributed to some of these ministers at this event, irresponsible, reckless, incendiary, I'd go so far as to say, and certainly doesn't comport with our strong policy statement, what we have made clear, that there can be no reduction in Gazan terror. Look, I wouldn't, you got a couple of ministers in the cabinet using this reckless behavior, or conducting this reckless behavior and making these incendiary comments. That doesn't mean that we still don't have an open line of communication with Prime Minister Netanyahu and his cabinet, the war cabinet, and that they haven't been receptive to listening to us and to our messages. These are individual cabinet members. They can speak for themselves and what they said and what they did. It doesn't comport with our view, and we find it reckless.
Our next story is on the aftermath of the killing of 3 US soldiers in Jordan over the weekend. Many analysts now say that the US policy in the Middle East can no longer be described as an attempt to stop the Israel-Gaza conflict from triggering a bigger regional war. That ship sailed a while ago. The critical task now for President Joe Biden, as he mulls retaliation over the deaths of 3 Americans in an attack by suspected Iranian proxy forces in Jordan on Sunday, is to prevent that region-wide war from tipping out of control. President Biden told reporters on Tuesday that he had made a decision on how to respond to the attack on US troops in Jordan, and warned that he held Tehran responsible in the sense that they are supplying the weapons to the people who did it. But expressing the balancing act that he faces in seeking to punish the perpetrators, downgrade their capabilities and restore deterrence, Biden added, "I don't think we need a wider war in the Middle East. That's not what I'm looking for." But it's indisputable that the United States is already embroiled in a war in the wider Middle East less than 3 years after Biden officially decreed the end of a 2-decade-long combat mission in Iraq that exhausted the US and caused deep political trauma. It is also clear that the Biden administration's effort to prevent an escalation is not working. US strikes against Iranian-backed militia throughout the region, which followed more than 160 attacks on American military facilities, did not deter Sunday's drone strike. And missile and drone attacks against commercial shipping in the Red Sea haven't stopped, despite roiling US airstrikes against their launch sites and infrastructure in Yemen. So Biden has now arrived at the unenviable position that presidents often face when all potential options before them are bad, and the very task of seeking to slow a deepening crisis may end up exacerbating it. The catalogue of violence that has erupted outside Gaza, where tens of thousands of Palestinians have been killed after 1,200 Israelis died in Hamas terror attacks on the 7th of October, underscores the grave potential of the war. Hezbollah, a pro-Iranian group based in Lebanon, has been waging a low-grade war against Israel. On Monday alone, it said it had launched 13 attacks on targets in northern Israel. The Israeli Defense Forces said that evening they'd carried out airstrikes on Hezbollah targets in Lebanon. 2 months of Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping have disrupted global supply chains and raised the cost of the cargo trade, risking a major economic impact. The US is leading a coalition of nations to protect trade. The US and Britain launched strikes against Houthi targets in Yemen this month, and Washington has carried out multiple follow-ups. But even Biden has admitted that the strategy has not stopped Houthi attacks. The US also launched strikes against targets linked to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, in Syria. The Biden administration has carried out attacks on Iran-backed groups in Iraq, severely straining relations with the Baghdad government and raising concerns that US troops stationed in the country to fight terrorism could actually be asked to leave. Israel expanded its own war by carrying out a drone strike that killed a senior Hamas leader in Beirut, fueling tensions in Lebanon, a nation beset by severe economic, political and security crises. Iran has blamed Israel for an attack that killed a number of Revolutionary Guard officers in Damascus in Syria. The only upside seems to be that some worst-case scenarios haven't occurred yet. For example, a massive onslaught of missile attacks by Hezbollah against Israeli cities. This group has a far greater capacity to hurt Israel than Hamas does, according to many experts. And while the weekend attack that killed the 3 Americans is tragic for their families and the country, there has not so far been a large-scale attack on US interests. For instance, Catastrophic damage to a US naval ship with huge loss of life that could multiply the intensity of the conflict on multiple fronts. The calibrated escalations have fueled an impression in Washington that Iran does not want a full-scale regional conflagration any more than its arch-enemy, the United States, does. But if the progression of the conflict has been steady, it's not a given that it'll stay that way. I think it's very important to note that this is an incredibly volatile time in the Middle East. That's what US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said on Monday, adding, "I would argue that we have not seen a situation as dangerous as the one we're facing now across the region since at least 1973 and arguably even before that." Now, Biden faces some tough choices. Hawkish Republicans like South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham are demanding that Biden attack Iran on Iranian soil. Republican presidential candidate Nikki Haley says he should target leaders of the IRGC. Biden's likely 2024 election for Donald Trump is simultaneously blasting Biden as weak and accusing him of dragging the US into another Middle Eastern quagmire. Also, on the left, however, is dismay from some at Biden's refusal to demand a ceasefire in Gaza. Many politicians, experts and commentators have repeatedly speculated about the options, often citing the idea that the US needs to send a tough message, but also must avoid sending the conflict into an even worse place. But one lesson from the last few months, and indeed the disastrous last 20 years of US policy in the Middle East, is that formulations and assumptions that make sense in Washington rarely play out as anyone expects in that treacherous region. This is why Biden's dilemma is so acute. How exactly does he find the sweet spot between deterrence and disastrous escalation? Will the reprisals that he does take put US forces at even greater risk, or will Iran just ignore them? Whenever a president takes military action, they must consider what's next, not just how an adversary will respond immediately, but in months to come, and how the US is prepared to counter those reactions. On Monday, Blinken predicted that the US response would be multi-leveled. It would come in stages and be sustained over time. No president can afford to look like he's lost control when US troops are dead. This is especially the case for Biden, with accusations of weakness at the heart of Trump's 2024 case against his successor. GOP critics have long accused Biden of appeasing the Islamic Republic and see recent events as a result of that. Some argue that the rationale for attacking Iran would be that incremental and calibrated attacks on Iranian proxies haven't worked, and that Iran is a mortal threat to the United States and its allies and could only be deterred by direct military action. Still, the lesson from Trump's assassination of Iranian intelligence chief Qasem Soleimani in 2020 is that it did not prevent Iran from expanding its regional threat. And Trump did not dare to attack him in Iran. The attack took place in Baghdad. There is no sign yet that the US will attack Iranian soil. The White House's top national security spokesperson John Kirby has told reporters repeatedly that the US has no interest in a war with Iran or its clerical regime. And the consequences of American strikes on Iran would likely be so escalatory, probably unleashing Tehran's proxies like Hezbollah with full force on Israeli and US interests, and a consequential major US-Iran war, that it's an unthinkable possibility. The question Biden faces is this: how does he assert US power in a widening regional war in a way that doesn't make the conflict even more dangerous, expansive, and likely to careen out of control? Now, even as we analyze what Biden's options in this complex scenario are, another question that some are asking is just why do so many US military bases still exist in the Middle East long after the end of the Iraq War? Now, according to the Pentagon, over the past 4 months, Iranian-backed militants have mounted over 150 attacks on bases occupied by US forces in Iraq and Syria. This has given rise to serious concerns over escalating tensions in the Middle East, with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warning of further spillover of the war in Gaza into the wider region. At the same time, the Gaza conflict is also forcing all parties, the Middle Eastern nations that host US bases, and the United States itself to evaluate their security partnerships. Sunday's attack took place near the Al-Tanf base in Syria, close to the Iraqi and Jordanian borders. Since 2016, Al-Tanf has served as a launching point for counter-Islamic State operations and training for Syrian opposition factions fighting the jihadist group. About 900 US troops are in Syria, ostensibly as part of the international coalition fighting the extremist group, the Islamic State, or ISIS. Now, ISIS took control of large swaths of Iraq and Syria back in 2014, but was considered to be largely defeated by 2019. More recently, observers have said that there have hardly been any operations against ISIS. But the border area in this part of northern Syria is a puzzle of competing domestic and international interests, including those of Turkey, Russia, Iran and the US, alongside various Syrian and Syrian Kurdish actors. This is why US troops are still there. Al-Tanf is also used to disrupt the activities of Iranian proxies in Syria. It also serves as leverage in the long-running negotiations of the country's future. American soldiers also support what they call partner organizations in the area, including the Syrian Democratic Forces, a Syrian Kurdish group that controls large parts of northeastern Syria. The suicide drone attack in Jordan hit what is known as Tower 22, a logistics support base around 20 kilometers away from the Al-Tanf base, crewed by around 350 US troops who are also supposedly there to combat the ISIS group. Tower 22 is actually in Jordan, although the Jordanian government appears to have tried to downplay this fact in news reports. Jordan's royal family has been critical of the way the Israeli military offensive in Gaza is being conducted, and Jordanian citizens have voiced opposition to Israel's role in the Palestinian conflict. The country's government and royal family must balance this with long-term cooperation and contact with the US and Israel. There are currently around 3,000 US troops stationed in Jordan at the invitation of the Jordanian government. In particular, the US military has helped to fund and set up Jordan's border security. The US military regularly makes use of Jordanian air bases, but for example, the Jordanians have denied that US weapons for Israel are being transported over their borders. During and after the US invasion of Iraq that toppled the regime of Saddam Hussein, US troop numbers peaked at about 150,000, but over the last 2 decades, that number has been reduced to around 2,500. These troops are also there as part of the international coalition fighting ISIS. Analysts say the debate about US presence has moved on from the anti-ISIS mission, as Iraqis probably have enough capabilities to stop ISIS from relaunching a large insurgency. But there are other benefits of the presence of the American troops in the region, like training, reconnaissance, aerial support and intelligence sharing. In Iraq too, the US sees itself as a counterweight to growing Iranian influence in the country. But this is also why attacks against US troops have been happening in Iraq for years. Iran-backed militias, who now also play a significant political role, are opposed to the US presence and have found many reasons to attack American bases there with rockets and drones. The Gaza conflict offers them more excuses. In the around 2 years, starting in January 2021, there were about 60 attacks on US troops. Since mid-October in 2023, there have been closer to 160 attacks in just 4 months. Iraq has recently initiated talks about whether remaining US soldiers who are there at the invitation of the government to fight ISIS will be asked to leave permanently. By far, the largest US troop deployments are in smaller Gulf states. Altogether, Qatar, Kuwait and Bahrain host more than 30,000 American military personnel. All these 3 countries are designated major non-NATO allies. As a result of a military partnership that has grown since the late 1980s, Kuwait now has the 4th largest US troop presence in the world. Even though Kuwait is small, the country is strategically significant because of its key geographical location in the northeast corner of the Arabian Peninsula and astride the Europe-Asia air corridor. Kuwait itself is often neutral in regional disputes and depends on the US presence for its own defense. Unlike many other US allies in the region, it doesn't charge the Americans for use of its land. In Qatar, the Al Udeid Air Base hosts around 10,000 US personnel. It was the headquarters for US operations in Afghanistan and then the country's 2021 withdrawal from the country. Qatar and the United States have had a military relationship since the early 1990s and in early January extended their agreement on the airbase for another 10 years. Observers have suggested the deal was not announced with great fanfare because of sensitivities around the Gaza conflict. The Americans' largest naval base in the Middle East is located in Bahrain, home to America's 5th fleet and over 9,000 military personnel. Bahrain was the first nation in the Middle East to host a major US military base, and strategically Bahrain is the central node of the international maritime presence, securing the world's most important choke points.
Yes. I do hold them responsible in the sense that they're supplying the weapons to the people who did it. I don't think we need a wider war in the Middle East. That's not what I'm looking for.
Donald Trump be allowed on the ballot?
As far as I'm concerned, that's fine.
Why do you need the polls if he's a threat to democracy, as you say?
Because guys like you.
Jesus, man. It's early. Have you done everything you can do with executive authority? Or is there more you can do after the president?
Not all I can do. Give me the power. I've asked for the very day I got in office. Give me the border patrol. Give me the people. Give me the people, the judges. Give me the people who can stop this and make it work right.
There are some concerns in your party about the possible escalation of military involvement in the Middle East.
We'll see.
जानना है तो देखिए, समझना है तो सुनिए, सीखना है तो पूछिए और कमाना है तो खरीदिए। जानकारी, सलाह और निवेश सब एक ही सुपर ऐप पर। पैसे का सवाल है तो जवाब है Money9। आजादी पैसे की, अभी डाउनलोड करें।
Currently, the industry is facing a lot of challenges as far as demand is concerned. Basically, the US markets has slowed down because of high inflation.
So obviously, diamonds being a dream product, something which doesn't have a utility value or is seen as a luxury. So that obviously goes off your shopping list. That's the first item that will go off your shopping list, especially in recessionary trends.
That lab-grown diamonds are not mined, and they do away with the entire mining. So they save up on all the environmental damage that is associated with mining, and of course, the mining cost, which is why they're even more affordable.
People that is impacted by all these recessions are the artisans, are the people who work in this industry, right? But I think